The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, we now have a special prosecutor in the Trump-Russia investigation. After Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey last week, we had the revelation earlier this week that Donald Trump allegedly asked James Comey to drop the FBI's investigation into disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. We heard calls from both sides, mostly from Democrats, but from some Republicans as well, for an independent counsel, also known as a special prosecutor, to be assigned to oversee this entire Trump-Russia investigation. And one of the reasons for this is that, and this is a fear that escalated with the firing of James Comey, was the fear that Donald Trump would appoint a new FBI director that would just favor the president and compromise the integrity of yet another investigation. Not that we haven't seen other investigations into Trump-Russia already compromised. A very reasonable concern. Some Republicans have still been resisting the idea of bringing in an outsider, but the Justice Department has succumbed to the pressure, you could say. And it was announced that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, he's the guy who's been acting as Attorney General in all Russia-related matters after Jeff Sessions recused himself, with the exception of Jeff Sessions recommending the firing of James Comey. In any case, Rod Rosenstein has appointed former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special prosecutor to facilitate this investigation into the Trump-Russia scandal. If that name sounds familiar, it's because, again, he was the FBI director appointed by George W. Bush in 2001, served until 2013 when James Comey took over. So the obvious question is, are we going to get an unbiased and fair investigation as a result of this? On the one hand, yeah, Mueller's a Republican. He still technically answers to Rosenstein and Trump, but he's not known as a partisan hack. He has no direct ties to Donald Trump that we know of as of right now. No major controversies in his past. He stood up when George W. Bush was abusing his power. Obama liked him enough to extend his term when he was FBI director. And I think most people know that he'll be more impartial than whoever Trump would have appointed to replace James Comey.
Yeah, and that is good news. It just comes as a surprise, though, because Rosenstein was, as you mentioned, very influential in the firing of James Comey.
Yeah.
So it seemed as if he was trying to sweep this whole Russia investigation under the rug.
Sure.
And this is a complete 180. Very good news, especially because the FBI investigation and the House investigation have both been significantly undermined in the past few months.
Discredited to some degree. A quote from Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein: "What I have determined is that based upon the unique circumstances, the public interest requires me to place this investigation under the authority of a person who exercises a degree of independence from the normal chain of command. A special counsel is necessary in order for the American people to have full confidence in the outcome." According to White House officials, Donald Trump didn't find out about the appointment of a special prosecutor until after the appointment was made, and he reportedly wasn't happy about it at all, which is terrific. And Trump responded to all of this in a statement yesterday saying, quote, "As I have stated many times, a thorough investigation will confirm what we already know. There was no collusion between my campaign and any foreign entity. I look forward to this matter concluding quickly." Yeah, I bet Trump wants this to conclude quickly. That's obviously clear. The Department of Justice sort of had no choice. So I know you're reading into Rod Rosenstein's decision as a sort of 180. Did they really have a choice? I mean, as you pointed out, the FBI investigation had been tarnished by the firing of James Comey. The House investigation has been a joke for months at this point. The entire executive branch would look so corrupt if they didn't do this, and they probably know that. But yet, it is still curious that one of the guys who recommended firing Comey now says, let's put in a special prosecutor.
And they're also looking out for themselves too, right? They have to keep their own hands clean. And yeah, it is remarkable that Trump is trying to speed up this investigation, because as it goes on, there's more of a chance of them finding something. That's why he asked Comey to end the investigation into Michael Flynn, saying he's a good guy. Don't worry about it.
Great. No good guy has ever committed a crime worthy of investigation. Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland said yesterday, quote, "Rather than make this go away, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein has taken an important step toward restoring the credibility of the DOJ and FBI in this most serious matter. So like James Comey, Robert Mueller will not have to consult with or inform the Justice Department nor the White House about the investigation. The FBI has already said we are not going to be keeping the White House up to date on what is going on with this investigation. Trump will undoubtedly replace Comey eventually with someone who is friendly to Trump, and we definitely don't want that person leading the investigation. So now at least we have the appearance that the DOJ investigation is getting more serious. We'll see if it actually does. It would have been better if an independent prosecutor could have been appointed by Congress, because then Trump wouldn't even be able to fire that person. But Trump would not be able to fire Robert Mueller without significant scrutiny.
I mean, I think that these things take time. Watergate took about a year and a half before Richard Nixon eventually resigned. So I think there's an urgency to try to get Trump out of office now, but it could take years.
It could, and it also might not be that great for Democrats. And I'm going to next week, we're going to dig into that. But people online already talking about, oh, this is the beginning of the end. I think it's a little soon to say that for now. I have for you today an absolute supernova leaked recording, okay? In 2016, a full month before Donald Trump became the Republican nominee, there were already some people suspecting that Donald Trump was connected to Vladimir Putin. That is not a surprise. What we have now learned, and I'm going to play some Washington Post video for you here, is that one of the people who in the summer of 2016 thought that that Donald Trump was connected to Vladimir Putin was Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy, and Paul Ryan immediately tried to shut down those concerns, saying, don't talk about that. The bombshell nature is stunning. Republican House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy on June 15th in a recorded meeting said to other Republicans that he believes Trump as well as Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher might be on the payroll of Vladimir Putin. Again, a Republican said this a full month before Trump became the Republican nominee. House Speaker Paul Ryan immediately interjected, shutting down the entire conversation. Let's listen to this video from the Washington Post. Put the seatbelts on, get the kids out of the room. Here is the first part of this.
The day before this meeting with the Ukrainian Prime Minister, the news breaks, the Washington Post breaks it, that the DNC has been hacked by the Russians. So McCarthy basically takes the conversation and turns it to what is happening in the United States. He begins by saying, I'll guarantee you that's what it is. The Russians hacked the DNC and got the op research that they had on Trump. And then McCarthy laughs. McCarthy then adds, there's two people I think Putin pays, Rohrabacher and Trump. There's then laughter by some of the lawmakers in the room, and then McCarthy adds, swear to God. Ryan then interjects and says, quote, this isn't off the record. No leaks, all right? Ryan then adds, this is how we know we're a real family here.
Wow. Wow. The Washington Post also went to Paul Ryan's office to try to get a comment. And here is, again, Adam Entus from the Washington Post, who is narrating this. He explains what happened when they tried to get a comment from Paul Ryan.
We first approached Ryan and McCarthy's offices to tell them we were publishing this. And we told them what we were going to have Ryan and McCarthy saying. And their response was to say it never happened, that there was no conversation like this. They said that it was untrue. They called it fiction. Later, we told them that we had a transcript of the conversation. And then they suggested that the transcript was false, that it was maybe even made up. Certainly inaccurate, they said. When we told them finally that we had listened to an audio recording of this conversation, they adjusted their statement. And what Ryan's office told us was that, that McCarthy had delivered, in effect, an inappropriate joke, and that he was not intending to be serious.
So the conversation never happened. Okay, the conversation did happen, but the transcript you have is not an accurate transcript. Oh, the transcript you have is exactly the same as the tape that you've obtained. Well, the entire thing happened, but it was all a joke. And if McCarthy was the one joking, why did Paul Ryan react the way that he reacted? The obvious takeaway is that Republicans knew, or at least suspected, a long time ago, almost a year ago, exactly what Trump was all along. A joke And once they can no longer deny it, it's a joke.
I don't think you're going to be too surprised by this, but I really don't buy the third excuse of it, because if McCarthy said swear to God, that implies that it's not a joke.
Right.
And if the whole crowd erupts in laughter, then it's not a bad attempt at a joke. It's a joke that hit.
Yeah, it's a very strange argument to make. I say subpoena everyone, Robert Mueller, get them all in, and let's figure out what's going on. And of course, there's people saying, David, you haven't heard the tape, so it's obviously untrue. Would Paul Ryan's office now say it happened, but it was a joke if the tape didn't exist? I mean, come on. This is like when people were saying the Trump-Russia leak thing isn't true. Trump went on Twitter and defended doing it. How can you still say that it's not true? I just don't get how people can argue that nothing happened. Paul Ryan's office has commented on it, assuming that it happened.
I mean, it's possible maybe that the Washington Post has a transcript, but they were bluffing on the idea of a tape to get them to respond in a different fashion. But you could tell just by Ryan's response that there's a clear separation between the Washington elite and the rest of the American public.
Yes.
And he's clearly putting party ahead of country here.
I will say. The scale and scope of undisclosed contact with Russian actors by the Trump campaign has just stepped up several notches. Current and former U.S. officials that are familiar with the exchanges told Reuters that Michael Flynn, as well as other advisors to Donald Trump's campaign, were in contact with Russian officials and others with Kremlin ties in at least 18 calls and emails during the last 7 months of the presidential campaign. These previously undisclosed contacts are being looked at now by the FBI, and congressional investigators are also looking at them in the context of the Trump-Russia scandal. 6 of the previously undisclosed contacts described to Reuters were phone calls between Sergei Kislyak, Russia's ambassador to the U.S., and Trump advisors, including Michael Flynn. We have also now learned that conversations between Flynn and Kislyak accelerated after November 8th because they were trying to establish a back channel for communication between Trump and Vladimir Putin. This is exactly what, back in April, we learned. And at the time, it involved Betsy DeVos's brother, Blackwater chairman or CEO or whatever, Eric Prince, and meetings in the Middle East to try to establish this back channel. This doesn't confirm that specifically. But again, now, Pat, what people are missing is we had a report in April about the desire to establish a back channel with Russia. And then we have yet another instance here of communications that were attempting to establish a back channel directly between Trump and Vladimir Putin. Once again, we have corroboration, not the debunking of any of these allegations. And the Trump White House, as recently as January, denied that there was any contact, period, with Russian officials during the 2016 campaign. We now know about Michael Flynn. We know about these 18 contacts. We know about Jared Kushner and the dozens of meetings that he failed to disclose. And obviously, once it becomes completely undeniable, the White House will say, okay, fine. That one thing happened, but you don't have proof of anything else. And then we get proof of the other ones. And they say, fine, that second thing happened, but there's no proof of anything else. And drip, 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 we've got a bucket full of proof.
And it's very suspicious now how Trump's lawyers have to stop him from trying to reach out to Michael Flynn to talk to him. Yeah. You know, you'd think that Trump fired the guy. He doesn't want to do anything with him at this point. But the opposite is true. And you have to imagine that they're trying to get his story straight because, I mean, if Michael Flynn is requesting immunity in exchange for testifying openly, you have to think that he has dirt on Trump and he might be able to turn on him.
Or might be swayed to. Yeah, no doubt about it. The White House. So what are different people saying when asked for comment about this? The White House didn't respond to requests for comment. Michael Flynn's lawyer declined a request for comment. In Moscow, a foreign ministry official declined to comment. A spokesman for the Russian embassy in D.C. said, we do not comment on daily contacts with local interlocutors. Once again, this also continues to corroborate past reports. So it is all coming off the walls. Reuters is reporting the same thing that we were hearing in April about a desire to create a back channel. Maybe starting a feud with the intelligence community while you're colluding with Russia isn't the best idea if you are soon to be president of the United States. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Ian St. Ange. Ian, thank you so much for supporting the work that we do. We mostly depend on the funding of people who listen to the podcast or watch us on YouTube or on Free Speech TV or listen to us on the radio. And the most direct ways to fund the program is to become a member at davidpakman.com/membership. There's a coupon code available. I voted 17 if you want. Also, you can make a pledge at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Even $1 a month helps us. If you can pledge more, by all means, do it. And you can also buy David Pakman Show gear at davidpakman.com/gear, including David Pakman Show coffee. And on that note, a really great documentary being worked on by longtime supporter and friend of the show, Greg Stevens, and it is called Love in the Time of Coffee. You can find out more about it at loveinthetimeofcoffee.com. It will use coffee as a sort of lens through which we can learn about globalization, trade, agriculture, farming, NAFTA, so many really important issues, economics, labor, employment, etc. They've got an Indiegogo campaign, which you can check out at loveinthetimeofcoffee.com. A lot on the minds of many of those people in our audience who have subscribed to our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit. I was on there this morning. Pat, you're on there as well, right? You'll sometimes pop up in the comments.
Oh yeah, every few days I'll make my appearance. Yeah.
Don't go crazy. Don't start showing up there every day, Pat. Okay, so let's look at some of the popular and interesting discussions at davidpakman.com/Reddit. I hope you will join us there. First and foremost, the root of all evil in the U.S. A very interesting post from one of our viewers, listeners, about the root of all evil in the United States. I encourage you to check it out and join that discussion. Also on Reddit, a post called In Regards to Conservative Trump's Russia Leak Story. In other words, the story of Eric Erickson talking about the Trump-Russia leak, an interesting hypothesis and commentary, and people increasingly engaged in that discussion. Very respectful discussion among people who don't always necessarily agree. Also from our Reddit discussion forum, a post called Springtime for Putin and Russia. Is Trump guilty of illegal activity or just part of a ruse that went too far? And I don't know if you looked at this one, Pat. It's generating a lot of discussion, and it's the idea that it's not so much that Trump was complicit in some kind of scandal or plot, but that this all started as a sort of ruse. It went too far, and incompetence sort of saw Trump wrapped up in it, which I don't know if that's giving Trump credit or treating him like the sort of clueless buffoon that we've learned that he is. But it's an interesting hypothesis.
I think it's hard to believe that he wasn't involved in any way, or at least his top campaign advisors weren't involved.
Fair enough. Also from our Reddit discussion forum, my thoughts about Donald Trump's mental health. This is in response to the increasingly viral story from a couple months ago, which now is approaching 700,000 views on YouTube and about 1 million views on Facebook, about Donald Trump possibly showing early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. Interesting discussion you can participate in. And lastly, if he goes, there will be trouble. If he stays, it will be double. Making an argument that I actually think is a pretty good argument, Pat, which is Donald Trump's impeachment and successful removal from office would bring with it a whole new series of problems that could end up being worse than just having a sort of scandalized Trump in there for 4 years. And we'll touch on that next Monday, but I think there's a good case to be made for that.
Especially if he is impeached, then is Mike Pence really better than Donald Trump? I mean, I don't think he is.
That is one of the many relevant questions that are coming up. So davidpakman.com/Reddit. Please join our Reddit discussion forum. A lot of good stuff going on there. And the moderators are keeping the trolling down to a dull roar, so I think you'll be pleased with that. The story I'm about to tell you is so embarrassing that you might hope it isn't true, but unfortunately, it is all too real. We know that Donald Trump's attention span and focus are problematic. Trump tells his advisors to give him information, briefings, by giving him one single sheet of paper with a few bullet points and lots of pictures or maps. Numerous people have commented that Trump is constantly distracted by a TV that's on in the background of whatever room he's in. We know Trump isn't a reader. His co-author of The Art of the Deal, Tony Schwartz, said he never saw Trump near a book. He believes Trump has not read an entire book in his entire adult life. We have real questions about Trump's reading abilities. That's okay, I guess, right? Trump goes with his gut. He needs a small amount of information, and his instincts take over, and they're the best instincts, so there's no need to worry.
Well, the thing is, I mean, even if you're not a reader, there's plenty of other ways to take in information, especially if you have the resources that he has where other people can brief him. So that alone isn't so bad.
Right. Once you limit the briefings to 2 bullet points and a picture, the ability to learn by briefing also is hindered. Here's here's Mark Fisher from the Washington Post describing a conversation he had with Trump during the election to sort of give some color to this attention issue that Trump has.
So I pressed a little harder and I said, well, how are you preparing? How will you make decisions as president? And he said, well, I'm not going to be reading any big reports or anything like that. And he told me the story of how a guy from Wall Street came to him, wanted him to make a deal in China, and said there was an innovative kind of financing that he wanted Trump to consider. And so Trump said, well, I don't know anything about that. And the guy said, no problem, we've done some research. I have a report, I'll send it to you today. And Trump said, don't send me any blanking reports, and said, because I won't read them.
So that's the background. What's the news? Well, as you may have heard, Trump's going to be attending a NATO summit in Brussels, Belgium next week. By the way, Brussels, beautiful city. I was there 3 weeks ago. One of the best cities. Absolutely tremendous, really. So there's concern about Trump attending this summit because there's lots of speeches. And according to several sources who work for NATO, as well as former senior U.S. officials, NATO is telling other heads of state who will be speaking at the summit, who will be talking to Trump. I mean, I can't believe this is what's happening. Other world leaders have been told to limit their speeches to no more than 4 minutes. They're looking for 2 to 4 minute speeches to accommodate Donald Trump's attention span. The president of the United States needs to be accommodated with speeches not to exceed 4 minutes. One source said, quote, "It's kind of ridiculous how they're preparing to deal with Trump. It's like they're preparing to deal with a child, someone with a short attention span and mood, who has no knowledge of NATO, no interest in in-depth policy issues, nothing. They're freaking out." They've also said they've given up on their original plan to give Trump a full-length written report about NATO's position on different world issues, because as we know, Donald Trump is just not going to read it. Why don't they just give Trump briefings in the form of a puppet show or something like that? As long as it's a short puppet show, he probably only has the attention span for like a 4 to 6 minute puppet show.
I'm sure all these world leaders are jockeying for position as to who gets to speak last because,
right.
As we know, whoever Trump hears last has the most influence over him.
That's what he goes with.
He doesn't change his mind after
that.
Yeah,
any decision he makes is based on the last thing someone told him 5 minutes ago. I would actually restrict speeches to 140 characters. That's really the amount of depth Donald Trump is used to going into. Should we be worried, serious question, should we be worried that this might allow foreign leaders to manipulate Donald Trump? If you've got a leader who's not willing or even capable of listening or comprehending or evaluating large amounts of information, and other countries are aware of that, can't they just figure out how to do a manipulative 2-minute summary that will influence Trump with no context whatsoever?
I mean, there's certainly reports about foreign governments influencing his decision-making. We see that particularly with the Russians nowadays.
Yeah. How obviously that's happening now. I'm speaking hypothetically. Like, imagine if this happened. Yeah, you're right. Okay. It is happening. This tweet from Donald Trump has never been more relevant. Remember when under the Obama administration in June of 2014, Trump tweeted, "Are you allowed to impeach a president for gross incompetence? Isn't it a sign of incompetence if Trump can't listen to speeches exceeding 4 minutes in duration?" And the other issue that's also concerning staff is Trump doesn't know anything about NATO, but I wouldn't worry about that. I mean, that's been going on for a while. A NATO official is quoted as saying, quote, "People are scared of his unpredictability, intimidated by how he might react, knowing the president might speak his mind or tweet his mind." That's the other concern. Trump might just start talking off the cuff. And anytime that happens on a policy issue, things are about to get a little bit dicey.
Maybe he'll start talking about how human energy is like a battery and you have a finite amount, so you shouldn't exercise because you're going to waste the amount of energy you started off as a child.
He said exercising can deplete the energy you have.
That's why he doesn't believe in exercise, yeah.
Wow. And then having KFC on his private jet. All right, let's talk briefly about James Comey. There's a lot more to get to, including part 2 of my interview with Michael Shermer. You'll remember Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. Comey said he'd be willing to testify to Congress as a private citizen, only if it was a public hearing. Last week, after Comey was fired, Senate Intelligence Committee asked Comey to testify behind closed doors. Comey declines. He doesn't want to do it behind closed doors. Yesterday, in the wake of the news that, number one, that a special prosecutor has been appointed, and number two, we learned 48 hours ago that James Comey was asked by Donald Trump reportedly to end the investigation into Michael Flynn. Now, Senator Richard Burr and Ranking Member Mark Warner, Republican and Democrat respectively, from the Senate Intelligence Committee, have said we are okay with James Comey testifying in public as long as he also does a closed session. I hope he will accept this invitation. Richard Burr hopes that Comey will accept this invitation. There will be questions about the Russia investigation. There will be questions about Comey's abrupt firing. Normally, when you have public testimony at these Senate panels, there's not exactly high TV ratings. This could be the record-breaking ratings for a former intelligence official testifying before a Senate panel, couldn't it?
Yeah, and also at these Senate panels, usually it's hyper-partisan. So the Democrats in past testimonies when it came to James Comey would ask about Russia, whereas the Republicans would ask about the baseless claims that Obama wiretapped Trump or Hillary Clinton. I think you're getting to a point now where even the Republicans have to ask about the 2016 election and if Trump and the Russians colluded.
It's almost starting to look weird if they don't ask about it. When might this happen? Could be as soon as next week. Jake Sherman from Politico tweeted earlier today or late yesterday, quote, Jason Chaffetz just told me he has scheduled a hearing for next Wednesday and is inviting James Comey. So maybe Comey will do both of these, the hearing, the public hearing and the closed one. We'll have to see. I actually think you sort of need the closed testimony because he's not going to be able to talk about everything publicly. I do think it's important to have the public one to put a public face on the fact that he's showing up there and is willing to testify. I'd like to see both.
I think it's also important to get him on record talking about how Trump asked him to end the Michael Flynn investigation.
Yes.
And even the part about him requesting that journalists who publish classified information
be
be imprisoned. Yeah.
It's outrageous. And as I've talked to you before, the contemporaneous notes of FBI agents are considered to be reliable testimony. And it's actually a sign of someone who takes what they're doing seriously. I mean, this is something business people do. This is something doctors do, lawyers. Right after a meeting, you jot down your notes about it, because then if you need to review it 6 months later, your recollection won't be perfect. And the fact that James Comey did this doesn't strike me as suspicious. It strikes me as making him even more trustworthy. And there will be no shortage of time to analyze what it is that Comey ultimately says. You can discuss this along with anything else that's on your mind on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/Reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Michael Shermer, publisher of Skeptic Magazine, a New York Times best-selling author, also a monthly columnist for Scientific American. We sort of paused our conversation in the first part, Michael, talking about some strategies you have for attempting to make others open to maybe other ideas or other beliefs. I think that this is sort of a natural transition into some of your work in the skeptic community and with regard to conspiracy theories. And maybe we could start at the broadest possible level. I'd love to hear a little bit from you about why you believe conspiracy theories, generally speaking, can be so gripping and appealing to individuals. And one idea I've had is that, to some degree, there's probably an aspect of conspiracy theories that is calming to some, in that if you can figure out who really did this or that, that's much easier for someone to sort of live with than the possibility that there are random events, or at least events that we cannot control. That's far scarier in some sense. What do you think?
Yeah, perfectly put. Absolutely. That's one of the several factors that go into conspiratorial thinking. First, it's good to acknowledge that there are conspiracies that really do happen. I mean, Lincoln was assassinated by a conspiracy. Watergate was a conspiracy. The recent NSA revelation, the WikiLeaks revelations about the NSA, there's something of a conspiracy going on there. We'd like to know what's really going on. Fair enough. Then the theories about the conspiracies, that's a whole other thing. And so in general, the psychology behind it is, exactly what you said. It kind of, we sense that maybe there's something else afoot and we want to know, well, what is it? And it turns out that a lot of history turns on randomness. And the reason that's uncomfortable is because you can't do anything about it. There's no controls. The economy is a super complex thing, and there's very little we can do predicting the price of gas, for example. No one knows. What? I mean, I'd really rather know that 12 people in the Illuminati in London are determining wars and the outcomes of economic crises and things like that. It's a sense of control, a sense of that things happen for a reason rather than randomness. This is also a religious impulse that nothing happens by chance. Everything happens for a reason. I went left instead of right at the stairwell, and my life was saved. The classic story from 9/11. In terms of just how cognition and how it feels emotionally about how you engage the world, a conspiracy theory kind of wraps a structure around it, and I can see where I fit into this thing. And that's very comforting. So that's a big part of it, I think.
And when you've dealt with everything from sort of political conspiracy theories to claims about the paranormal, cults, pseudoscience, everything in between. Let me put it this way. Is there some thread that unites all of those areas? And are there particular differences between, for example, beliefs about the paranormal, pseudoscience, and political conspiracy theories that really separate out those different categories?
Yeah, I think one of the common threads is power. Who has it and who wants it? And so most conspiracy theories are constructed by people who don't have the power, who think someone else does have power, in particular power over them or their lives. And so we tend to overestimate as outsiders the power of, say, CEOs or corporations or government agencies about what they can really do. And unfortunately, occasionally, big CEOs, corporations, and government agencies and politicians really do have power and abuse it. So it's probably in a way good that we have a little bit of skepticism about power, people in power. This is why the founders, constructed our government the way it is with checks and balances, because people do conspire to, benefit themselves and their relatives over the general populace when they're supposedly public figures. And that's why we do have a conspiratorial bent there. That's probably good. But of course that he spins into something like an Alex Jones type rant about every single politician is in on it. Thousands of government and corporate CEOs are conspiring to run the world or something like that. There it goes off the rails. So as just a couple general talking points, the more people that have to be involved in a conspiracy, the less likely it is to be true. The more elements that have to come together just right for it to happen, the less likely it is to be true. People can't keep secrets. People are not that competent. Government agencies are not that efficient. And then finally, there's kind of this idea. I talked about cognitive dissonance in our last episode, and so with cognitive harmony, we want to balance there. So you take something like the Holocaust, the worst genocide in history, committed by the Nazi regime, one of the worst political regimes in history. So there's kind of a sense of balance there. But if you take something like the assassination of JFK by a lone nut, so the Lee Harvey Oswald lone nut, it just doesn't jive. It's like, how can this or 9/11, 19 guys with box cutters? Come on, really? That it just doesn't balance. We want all these other things in there. It was the Bush administration and all these other covert operations were at work, and it was a false flag operation, and then to go to war and all this stuff, rather than the Bush administration took advantage of this thing that happened to then push their political agenda, which all government administrations do. And so the random element is what we don't like, and that's probably explains a lot more history than conspiracy theories do.
This idea of sort of like a coherent narrative, not that long ago, I read Thinking Fast and Slow by the great Daniel Kahneman. And when he talks about some of the cognitive biases that as humans we can sort of fall prey to, a lot of it has to do with we overestimate our ability to intuitively determine whether there's a pattern or whether there's randomness, where something makes sense or whether it doesn't. And it seems that there might be a lot of overlap between that and what you're talking about in terms of skepticism and debunking, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So this process I call patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise. And the problem is we don't have a good error detection system in our brains for determining which patterns are real and which are not, which is why we need science. You know, like things like climate change, you can't just intuit it. You can't just think, well, it was cold yesterday, so I guess global warming is not real. We can't see the long-term trends over hundreds of years or thousands of years because our senses are not geared to that. We're really bad at gambling and investments and probabilities and statistics because our brains are not geared toward understanding big numbers, the law of large numbers and things like that. It really takes some kind of override of those intuitions you have. So Kahneman's absolutely right about that. Our instincts kick in and we think, well, I really have a sense of what's right. And sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. And that's why we need science.
Can we talk a little bit about some tools that might apply, ideally as broadly as possible, so to everything from particular religious claims to conspiracy theories, some ways in which our audience could sort of prepare themselves to not get tricked or swayed or bamboozled by what might seem like a pretty appealing case. It could be a religious belief, it could be a conspiracy theory, it could be pseudoscience. At the foundational level, how can, as thinkers, people in the audience start to evaluate different claims?
Yeah, so it begins with the principle of proportionality. We should proportion our confidence in a claim based on the amount of evidence for it. The little quip we have in skepticism, often attributed to Carl Sagan, but it was actually said by somebody else, which is another issue, how quotes gravitate up to the most famous person who ever said them. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Mm-hmm. So back to the story of the resurrection I mentioned before, it's not an extraordinary claim to think that someone named Yeshua, Jesus, existed in the first century. That was a common name. It's not an extraordinary claim that somebody was crucified. The Romans crucified people right and left. What is an extraordinary claim is the resurrection, and the evidence is not proportional to that extraordinariness. In fact, it's less than extraordinary. So therefore, skepticism would be a reasonable position to take. More recently, I was something of a climate skeptic in the 90s because, frankly, I just didn't think we had the evidence for it yet. But by the 2000s, I changed my mind because the evidence started piling up. So I proportioned my confidence in that theory based on how much evidence there was for it. And in general, that's a good way to look at any particular claim.
It does get difficult, though, when you have very, very well-spoken people, like, to take the religious world, people like Ray Comfort and William Lane Craig, who you'll listen to them for 15 minutes and you will sort of say, wow, they put together such a coherent narrative. It makes perfect sense. How can one protect themselves against that?
Well, so first of all, in that case, if they're just doing philosophy, if they're just making logical arguments, that is part of reason in the Western tradition of thinking, fine. But at some point, you should look out the window to see if there's some correspondence with nature, with reality. Because a lot of times these convoluted logical arguments take you down a path that ends up being, nowhere, because there's like 20 steps in between where you began and where you ended. That maybe we should have run an experiment or test or see if the data supports it or not. That's where the empiricism part of science comes in. Yes, reason, logic, but also look out the window and see if it's true or not, because we can fool ourselves pretty easily with those kinds of arguments. I've debated William Lane Craig, super smart guy, and but the flaws are that he relies completely on these arguments about infinity and first cause, prime mover. These go back centuries to medieval philosophers, early modern philosophers, and scientists just don't think that way, and that's why most scientists are not religious or they're religious skeptics, because at some point, if you can't test it, then it's reasonable to be skeptical. It doesn't mean we know there's no God, for example, but it doesn't mean we should necessarily believe just because there's some logical argument for it that makes sense. And And always we're the first and easiest person to fool because all of us, as Kahneman showed, are intuitive type 1 thinkers initially. We just, it just seems right. It just sounds good. It feels right. Those are not good ways to, run your life, because at some point you should introduce type 2 thinking, deliberative, rational, careful, apportioned beliefs based on how much evidence there is.
We have been speaking with Dr. Michael Shermer. He is the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. You can also check out his monthly columns for Scientific American and his New York Times best-selling books. Michael, thank you so much for talking to us. Really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's talk about business regulations. Last year, the U.S. EPA started the process of banning a really, really toxic pesticide called chlorpyrifos. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced. For years, health experts and scientists and environmentalists, they were trying to get this chemical banned. There's zero question about it being unhealthy for humans. The National Pesticide Information Center says that inhalation causes tearing of the eyes, runny nose, increased saliva and sweat production, nausea, dizziness, headache, muscle twitching, weakness or abdominal pain, tremors, lack of coordination, vomiting, diarrhea, pupil constriction with blurred and darkened vision. This is pretty serious stuff. And that children who are exposed to chlorpyrifos can end up with lowered IQ and higher rates of autism. In March, Donald Trump's EPA, run, of course, by Scott Pruitt, does what? They stop the process of banning this chemical. They change their stance, and they ultimately approve this chemical. Outrage in a wide variety of health advocacy agencies, environmental advocacy agencies. One of the first major decisions made by Trump's EPA administrator is to stop the process of banning a chemical known to be really bad for human health. Dow Chemical, not surprisingly, loved the decision. Here is a quote from Dow Chemical where they said, Dow AgroSciences remains confident that authorized uses of chlorpyrifos products offer wide margins of protection for human health and safety. Unrelated, I'm sure, Dow Chemical donated $1 million to Donald Trump's inaugural committee. Unrelated, I'm sure, merely a coincidence, Dow Chemical chairman and CEO Andrew Liveris goes to Donald Trump rallies, and Trump appointed him as chair of the administration's American Manufacturing Council. Mere coincidences, right? So what happened? On May 5th, about a month after this thing was, the banning process was stopped, 6 weeks maybe, a farm just outside Bakersfield, California, sees over 50 farm workers reportedly exposed to an airborne chemical that caused strange symptoms. 12 of them reported vomiting. One of them lost consciousness. It was later discovered that these workers were poisoned by none other than chlorpyrifos that had drifted through the air from another farm. The Kern County Public Health Media Officer addressed the public on TV saying, quote, anybody that was exposed that was here today, we encourage them to seek medical attention immediately. Don't wait, particularly if you're suffering from any symptoms, whether it's nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, seek medical attention immediately. Dow Chemical had manufactured it, and they did not respond to phone calls or emails about the incident. If only we had an agency that dealt with this sort of thing. Oh, wait a second, we've got the EPA. Except the EPA decided to go against scientific consensus and approve this chemical. Trump's been in office for, a few months now. I alluded to this the other day when we were talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline oil spill. We're starting to get to the point in Trump's presidency where it isn't just executive orders with no direct impact. The things Trump and his cronies are doing are actually happening in the real world and impacting and hurting people.
And it's not like when Republicans went to the polls in November that they were demanding a reverse on the ban of this chemical. I mean, maybe they wanted lower taxes, smaller government, drain the swamp. But it seems like when you get Republicans in there, you get all these extracurricular activities that no one really wants.
And don't mistake this for some kind of virtuous free market libertarian idealism, right? I mean, that's not what's regulating this it's not what's guiding this deregulation and the negligence. This is patronage to corporations. I told you about the donations from Dow and the connections between Dow Chemical's CEO and Donald Trump. This is the exact type of crony capitalist swamp filling that Donald Trump promised he would end, and it's not ending. It's actually accelerating, I would argue.
Right. I mean, most of the time, libertarianism, it just kind of translates to pro-corporatism, right? And, but I think even people who are in favor of small government realize that the government should be in charge of basic protections for our health, and I think this certainly qualifies even to them. Fringe
libertarians might disagree with you, but more reasonable libertarians, I think, get that you need some degree, something in terms of regulating business. Media titan Roger Ailes, who resigned from his position as chairman and CEO of Fox News Channel and Fox Business Network amid rampant sexual harassment allegations, has passed away at the age of 77. You'll remember that he was embroiled in just, I don't even know what number of sexual harassment and sexual assault allegations. Megyn Kelly, Gretchen Carlson, so many people at Fox News. He resigned from Fox last summer in the wake of those allegations. He has, to his death, denied the allegations. And this was a scandal that brought down one of the most powerful media people. Not the most powerful necessarily, but this was one of the most powerful media people, founded Fox News, shaped the modern cable landscape in so doing, previously worked as a producer and in politics as a consultant, etc. And he has passed away at 77, reportedly, Pat, increasingly isolated from friends and contacts since the scandal that led to his forced resignation. In a statement to Drudge Report, his wife, Elizabeth Ailes, put out a statement where she said, "I am profoundly sad and heartbroken to report that my husband, Roger Ailes, passed away this morning. Roger was a loving husband to me, to his son, Zachary, and a loyal friend to many. He was also a patriot, profoundly grateful to live in a country that gave him so much opportunity to work hard, to rise, and to give back. During a career that stretched over more than 5 decades, he worked in entertainment, in politics, and in news, affected the lives of many millions. And so even as we mourn his death, we celebrate his life. No cause of death given. Never appeared to be a particularly healthy guy, although looks can sometimes be deceiving. Reportedly not only isolated since his public downfall, but apparently one report I read said that he slipped into a coma a couple of days ago before ultimately passing away. I don't wish for people to die. No. I don't take pleasure in people's death. You can recognize that someone did terrible things and had a negative influence on society, culture, and our planet without wishing for them to die. I know there's people who were tweeting me, Pat, that they were really happy about this. It's hard for me to take pleasure in the death of anyone. That is someone's dad, after all. That is someone's husband, etc. But you can still recognize that this is someone who did things that were not good.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly you have to separate those who are adversaries and those who are enemies. So, if it's like Osama bin Laden dying, maybe you were allowed to cheer the death of that. But you can't be happy about this.
You're not happy about the passing of Roger Ailes. Are you going on record as saying that?
I thought we were going to talk about the death of Chris Cornell, who is, of course, the frontman for Soundgarden and Audioslave. That I'm very distraught about.
We're going to talk about that on the bonus show.
Okay.
All right. So Roger Ailes has passed away. I wonder if this was in not knowing what medical condition he had or passed away from, I wonder if the sort of repercussions of this insanely public embarrassment, I mean, accused of harassing dozens of women, a dozen women, whatever the number ultimately was, if that played a role in his eventual demise. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail with a proposed topic of discussion for the show. Let me leave it at that.
Hey, David. I'd love it if you would do a video segment on the BDSM community and the 50 Shades of Grey books and movies. As a member of this community for over 2 decades, I'd be happy to discuss the truth of and my experience with BDSM. You can contact me at 978. Also, for the record, I have not had any alcohol or cannabis prior to this voicemail. I think this topic is really relevant as there are so many preconceptions out there, thanks to these books and movies, that are simply not true.
Interesting. So Is this a topic you're pining for learning more about? Like, are you concerned, Pat, about all of these false understandings people have about BDSM?
I mean, a caller last week recommended that we do a reoccurring mental health segment, but I don't know if we really have the time to do a BDSM segment too, you know?
It's a lot to dig into, I guess, but let me open it to the audience. If you are in agreement with this caller that we really need to dispel some false notions about the world of BDSM, then we can explore that. And I don't know if this is the right person to address that issue. I don't know this person's BDSM credentials, but it's something we could absolutely look into.
I hope we don't have to do too much investigative research on this.
Yeah, this could be a nice little job for you on the weekend, you know. On the bonus show today, Chelsea Manning is now free. We will talk about that. Astronomers have discovered a puffy planet with the density of styrofoam. And as we mentioned earlier, Chris Cornell, former singer from Soundgarden and Audioslave, has passed away at age 52. We will address those stories and more on today's bonus show. Remember, there is only one way to sign up and get instant access to the bonus show, and that's by becoming a member at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.